Froggen's Alliance team have always been haunted by that original title before they had a specific organization, the Super Team. It was billed as though, okay, Froggen went out there and he decided to himself, you know what, I was in EG before, same players for 2 years, now I'm going to like pick my own team. And so because he picked all these different names that had been on different teams or had like high profiles, or at some point they've been very good or they're a rising talent now, because he picked them, then people decided like, okay, it still sort of is like the super team. Like you've picked your dream team of who you want to be on this team. And this is exactly, you want this guy here, this guy here, this guy here. That alone is a problem because it set this really unrealistic expectation that not only that they weren't just trying to be a good team or a better team than EG before, or a team that would be good for Froggen the player and allow him to have a vehicle to have success with. These weren't the expectations at all. Instead, it was set as though like, oh, this is going to be the maximum of whatever it could be, like whatever Froggen's potential as a player is. This is the team that'll take it to 100%, and then they'll all be really good, and then whatever they can accomplish, that's as good as Froggen the player is and as good as Froggen's teams could ever be. And that obviously is quite an unrealistic expectation for any Western team. Every Western team has compromises and problems and issues with a style works in this way but not against this opponent. There's never been, at least in the LCS era, the all-time great godlike Western team that could dominate the game in a way that, okay, maybe you could say early Moscow 5 did when they really were on top. There's never been that sort of team. So the reason why I'm setting the context like that is because it is a little bit frustrating when people call it the super team still, or they say that Froggen picked this team like that, because actually that's what I want to talk about in this video, is the idea that the super team that is Alliance, but what they could have been or what they might have been. So let's start out with where Froggen was before he joined this team, actually. He was in Evil Geniuses, formerly CLG, Logic Gaming Europe. Think about the team that he had at the end of the CLG EU era, because actually Froggen said in my Reflections interview with him, or essentially suggested that it's quite likely that if EG had won that last game in the third place decider of LCS Summer 2013 and they'd gotten the world spot, and I think maybe he might have said if they'd done okay at Worlds as well. Whatever, if they'd have gotten to Worlds, then actually he would have considered going into 2014 with that same lineup again. Well, let's look at who he had back then. He had Wicked playing top lane. You had to, even though Wicked's always been one of the stars of the team that he was in EG, you have to say that actually Wicked was one of the people who'd fallen off quite a bit, because the problem that Wicked had was, yeah, first of all, Aurelia wasn't in the meta, and that was his star signature champion that he's always been a lot better than the others on. That wasn't in the meta at all. You just could not play it in that particular time. Secondly, it was quite clear that he wasn't playing enough champions, or he couldn't, or they weren't viable enough. And he's even said himself, like, he let his mechanics slip, or he didn't practice the same, he didn't have the same hunger to play and get better as he did before. And you have to say his performance, taking all the rest of that into account, clearly was a weak point for EG, because I remember Alex Ich telling me in March of 2013, way back in my grilled interview with him, that actually people had kind of figured out in Europe, okay, Froggen's going to do what Froggen's going to do. He's going to get his farm, he's going to get his kills, he's going to play safe, he's going to play well. You can't really do anything to shut Froggen now. It's not like he's a guy you can just gank over and over. He's actually fairly ungankable for a mid laner. So, you know, the bot lane was never that strong in their team anyway in terms of mechanical skill. So they're going to play safe. That's their style. Snoopy's not a guy who's going to counter jungle or any of that stuff. He's playing at this passive style. So actually, teams figured out the way you beat EG was that you try to shot Wicked down hard. Try to go in on him, shut him down. And that worked to a degree. If you look at this period of time, March 2013, when Alex was telling me this is when EG's results had really fallen off. They'd had the poor result at IM Cologne, where they hadn't even got out the group stage. Then you go into LCS, they'd been doing quite bad early on, and then they had the period where they didn't even get out of the group at the IM World Championship, which is actually the tournament I was doing this at. So it's true, EG had kind of been figured out in that sense, and Wicked wasn't able to live up to that second carry role. He'd fallen off a bit. So look at the rest of the players. Snoopy, he'd definitely fallen off. All his passive style of champions, they weren't in the pool anymore. He was struggling in the newer era. We were going towards the carry jungle era and the more mechanical style of playing, and that was clearly always a weakness of his to some degree. He was more of the odd one, sort of decision-making, passive style of jungler. That was just his style. The counter gank style play. Crepo, his mechanics also he was one of the better mechanical players in the team, but his mechanics had dropped off a bit. I mean, you could even see after he didn't get picked up or didn't get a chance in the super team when they tried him for a little bit, you could kind of see that actually that looked like that's what remotivated him. I think he's even said as much, and that's why going into EG, he had put a lot more work in it. He was a bit better in that spring split in terms of the players in their team. Yellow Pete, yeah, it's not even enough to say Yellow Pete had fallen off. It's not even that he had really fallen off. Yellow Pete was a relic of Season 2. That was the problem. To some degree, you could say Snoopy was as well. But I mean, the problem was, Season 2, AD carry was a lot stronger. The impact it could have on the game a lot more, especially in the late game. If you got an AD carry to the late game with items and they weren't far behind, they could really output a lot of damage. And that was the thing with Yellow Pete. His whole style was, well, the whole team's style was this late game farm safe style to get to the late game, then have the big team fights. That's where their strength was. Well, if you think about it, he was a guy where, even though he had Crepo, had some skills, because they kind of accepted this is the sort of team we have. So we have this really strong mid laner, and then we have quite a strong top laner. We don't need our bottom lane to be some dominating bot lane. So actually what they kind of went for was like the safe laning style. Don't take any engagement you don't need to. I think Crepo said as much as like, unless like a kill was 100%, just don't even go for it. Just play safe off it instead. And so that's why Yellow Pete only really shone in that style of meta. Going into Season 3, it was already apparent like he wasn't close to the top in Europe. So this is the team they used to have before. Now think about the kinds of players that Froggen would go for in this super team and alliance. In general, he went for highly skilled mechanical players. That was like, this seemed to be the main criteria. I won't say that that's literally what he had in his mind. Like, I just want mechanical skill here. I think he was just looking for, I want the best player. But he was using the criteria almost of like, best player I can get at each position. I'm going to try him out. And then I actually think he did go for a team approach. Because the problem is, everyone behind the scenes will say that Alliance, in all the different versions actually that they had, they were generally just bodying it in scrims completely. And so as a result, it didn't just seem like these were the best players individually. It seemed like these are the best players we could get for our unit because we're winning all the practices. Everything seems to be going great. We're actually dominating early game and in laning phase. It's not like we're the old CLGU style where we have to go in the late game to win. It sounded like these were good pickups. So now let's look at some of the names that were in the mix for this super team and what might have been different. So the first name at top lane, this has been reported at some time in the past, but people, for some reason, don't necessarily know it's actually correct. But Alexic was originally being considered as a top lane player there. Now, at the time that was, I think that would have been a bad move. Like, there have been other metas that have come along in top lane where it might have made sense for Alexic to go there. Because, first of all, if you'd had such a strong team he had here, you wouldn't have had some of the problems he had in later teams because he didn't have such strong players at other positions in some of his other teams when he tried going top. But think of some of the top lane metas, and you've had a lot of the old mid lane champions going up there. So he would have already had some familiarity on them, and it's more of just a 1v1 lane. I could imagine Alexic could have dealt in this, but okay, admittedly, that maybe was a bit of a pipe dream to think that would work. Let's go to another top lane name. So before Wicked, around the time that Wicked was being considered was also... No, actually, I'll skip ahead of myself there. The other one I should have mentioned there was JWoww. JWoww was the next one. Now, he was like a challenger hype, and obviously he'd been playing for TCM. Crucially, JWoww was also one of the names that allowed the bot lane potential of Freeze and Edward to be a real factor that was potentially going to be in the lane. So that would have been an upside to trying it. But regardless, okay, in this team, it's hard to be entirely unfair and say, oh, JWoww would be like he was later and some of his problems in Gamers 2 and all that, because again, you're playing with much stronger players. You have a lot more breathing room to potentially develop into a certain role. You don't have to be a carry as much. The meta was different, obviously. With that said, I'd put that kind of in the Alexic one as well, where you kind of need a lot of improvement. You need a lot of things to go right. Whereas I prefer to just look at the players we have now and look at what they could have given us right now in terms of if you want to imagine Alliance being better. So move past JWoww, that's another one that wasn't so good. Now we're starting to get the ones that really could have made a difference. So a key one is, before Wicked was decided on, they were trying out Kevin. Because Kevin had decided, I want out of SK, that's not the team for me anymore. So if we think about Kevin in this particular position, what are the two things people complain about with Wicked? They say his consistency is a problem. Sometimes he has really good games. Sometimes he has games where he either feeds or he does a weird build. These are the things that you never have to worry about with Kevin. Kevin's always been the guy who's been really consistent. Now, people are going to say, oh, but some of those Millennium teams are not so good in terms of results and they had problems with these things areas. I don't like some of the players they had in those Millennium teams. They always struggled to have a really solid jungler. Support was a bit iffy. Kerp was super inconsistent. So when you're mid lane, one of your main carries is super inconsistent. Well, how is the top lane guy meant to be super consistent every time in terms of the stats or winning the game or always having a solid performance? It wasn't a good situation in Millennium. So look at Kevin over his whole career, and one of the things, like Darius, that's why we always compare him to him. He has had the consistency throughout his whole career. Like, there's never been a time in Europe, if you're being fair, when Kevin wasn't in the top 4 top laners in Europe. I'd probably even say the top 3 or the top 2. He's been that consistent for all the metas. Season 1, Season 2, Season 3, Season 4. Now we're going into Season 5. He has potential to do it again. This guy, like Darius, is incredibly consistent. And what's the other factor about Kevin that we always admire that Wicked didn't have? Kevin has always been relevant in these metas as a top player because his champion pool is never set at 1 or 2 champions. In fact, every different season, he has a different meta of champions that he can make work. Not only that, he can make the OP champions work as well. So he's actually similar to Darius in a sense in this regard as well. So that would have been an area where, okay, maybe there's some degrees that Wicked is stronger. Maybe he's a 1v1 player. But actually, I think Kevin would have provided a very, very solid kind of consistency in being able to adapt to all the different metas that Wicked wouldn't have brought. So I think that could have been an upgrade if they could have gone with Kevin instead of Wicked. Now we go down to... Okay, so obviously Jungler, Shook, that was the one pick that Froggen got that he wanted originally, started out with, and he went with. So that one, we can't say anything about. Froggen's a mid laner, obviously. Now the other 2 positions that could have been different. I'll start out with the support position, actually, because the support initially could have been Edward. Now, unfortunately, because of the context of where we are right now in history, and Gambit aren't doing very well, and Genja is Genja, and he's gone, and he obviously couldn't have the same game impact in latter days of Gambit. People are going to want to say now, oh, Edward isn't that good, and he's not really that... Edward's the sort of player where if you put him on the right team, he will be a fantastic player because of his playmaking potential. And this guy is a guy who never lacks for confidence. And this guy, crucially, here's the thing people don't mention, is the guy who does bring out new picks over and over. This was the guy who was like making Gragas support work for a while. His Thresh is always going to be a threat. I've even seen him trying out Azir support in solo queue and challenger. This is a guy who can have different picks at all, and crucially, he's a playmaker. So if you put him with the right sort of AD carry and the right sort of team, he will make plays for you. So think about that. One of the problems they suffered from in Alliance was having someone who's an engager. They had to, in the end, it tended to have to be Shook just going ham trying to engage, if they would, or Wicked has to engage on the people. It wasn't a good scenario. Instead, you want to be in a world where you have someone like Edward could have been sort of like what Xpecial was in the TSM lineup he was in the end. He was that playmaking support, engage onto the enemy, provide someone that people follow up on, and he can go tanky. Instead, Alliance, a lot of their problems were they'd get into that mid game where they had a slight lead or they were only slightly behind, and they just sort of like they were just waiting for something or waiting for someone else to do something, waiting for something to happen. They didn't have the decisive playmaking. So I always felt like playmakers was something I liked well. So Edward would have been one. Now then, Edward came as a package deal, with Freeze as his AD carry. He'd always wanted to play with him. He'd been duo queuing with Freeze for a long time before then. But secondly, he didn't want Wicked as his top laner. So listen, jokes aside, no one else wanted Wicked. No. But if Wicked just wasn't the top laner, so if it had been JWoww or even Kevin, then okay, we could have had Edward here. And we could have had Freeze, and this is someone he wants to play with, and it's an aggressive AD carry. So let's talk about that actually. I'll tie them in together, okay? So say we did get Edward and Freeze was the package deal. Freeze again is someone where, because of the context of now, people are going to be like, oh, I never thought he was that good anyway. If you talked to other AD carries in Europe, Freeze was always the guy who was like the surprisingly highly rated one by them. Like he'd always be the guy where if you asked them to go down their top 5 players, he'd be in there at like number 4 or number 3, depending on what era of time it was. And you'd say, oh, he's actually that good. Like he hasn't been in LCS, he's had all these problems. And they'd be like, no, he's quite solid. He's pretty good. If he just had the right opportunity, like you'd see how good he is. And his problem is he hasn't been in LCS, so he can't get the acclaim of like the memorable match that makes you think of the other good AD carries in Europe. But I definitely say someone like Freeze can be considered better than, or at very minimum at the level of, some of the people like Candy Panda or Mr. Rallis, who had points in the last 2 splits where people were rating them highly or saying they were pretty good. Freeze could have been very solid in this team, and crucially, he's an aggressive AD carry, but he'd be playing with an aggressive playmaking support. One of the problems Tabs had was that Tabs wants to be aggressive. He wants to be the second carry. He wants to make plays. But he was put with Nif, who's a passive style player, who's not an aggressive player in that playmaking sense. He's not going to try and dominate 2v2 in the lane. So I feel like they didn't let Tabs fully develop in that respect. If we look at another support they could have had now, Another one that people forget about was N-rated. Now, listen, I will put the caveat in, like I mentioned with Crepo before. N-rated probably did have some problems with the mechanics and overall level because he actually himself said something along the lines of like, okay, once I got turned down by the super team and I kind of had to go to like SK as my last resort and they kind of told me like, you better get your shit in order. That is kind of something that did make him say like, right, I have to rededicate myself fully if I want to ever be a top player again. So, okay, it's unfair to say look at him in SK and say that's what he would have been in Alliance or super team, but if we just say if he could have been, because we did see that he did become that in SK. Now here's a few things that are crucial if N-rated could have been the player, okay. First of all, even if he's with Tabs wants to be aggressive, great. That N-rated likes that sort of play. He has innovative picks, so he's going to do surprising things. You can play these aggressive, unusual styles in the bot lane. He always has been an aggressive style of player. Just because he's not super mechanically strong, don't think he's not aggressive. He is. He's that sort of like take a step forward where the other supports take a step back and play extra safe. Secondly, this guy, even though it has been overblown to some degree in SK, this guy can be a shot caller. If you want him to be a big macro game shot caller, that's what he did in SK. He did some of the macro shot calls. This guy can do it, and crucially, he can also help design some of the strategies of the game in terms of either helping you with some of the picks or just the strategical approach, not the tactic of the individual things you can do, but what strategy should we take against this sort of team? That's where Enray is very, very good. Like, you just look at his interviews or his talks, this guy's a really great mind for the game, but crucially, he can articulate it, and that means as a shot caller, he can be very powerful. Now, this would have taken care of a lot of the problems where maybe Froggen still can be the main shot caller, but now we have a secondary shot caller in certain situations, or to take over, or to make suggestions. Again, we can free up Froggen to some more aspects of the game. We're not limiting the team to the problems that they get into where they were very hesitant and they weren't decisive and they just kind of either let leads slide away. I'm thinking of the spring split mainly here, or they just had to close them out by brute forcing them by winning a team fight with just the mechanical skill. They could have been a better team. I'm not saying they're going to be Cloud9 overnight, but they could have been closer towards that or an SK than the Alliance TSM style that they kind of got stuck in instead. So N-rated would have been a very good one there. Could have potentially done a lot more. He also, let me think, who was the other one? Okay, so that's N-rated. Could have had, well, obviously we had Tabs in the end. I think the main point I'm making here is there are all these other directions that we could have gone in. Some of them, like I mentioned, maybe it could have been worse actually. JWoww, Alex, I'm not sure what would have happened with those. Those really could have been. Freeze, again, I'm not sure Freeze could have had that much of a difference, but then again, Freeze was contingent on you would have gotten Edward as well, and in the world where you get Edward, you're not having Wicked, so I think a lot of these ones balance themselves out. My point to make here is, there were all these different directions you could have gone in, and Froggen, either from circumstance, like the JWoww situation with the contract, and then Edward didn't want to play if it was going to be Wicked, some of these situations, and then N-rated maybe didn't have mechanicals, some of these situations, maybe the option actually was taken out of his hands, the decision was taken out of his hands, and that's kind of the point I'm making here, is that a lot of these picks were ended up being either the second, the third, or even the fourth kind of choice or person you've tried out that Froggen had to go with. It wasn't that he didn't put it, it wasn't like one of these rich guys like in Hollywood producer, okay, who's like, oh, I've heard there's a lot of buzz around Clive Owen. Get me Clive Owen on the phone. I've got to have him in my next film. It's more like he was like, is Clive Owen available? They're like, nah, he's not available, mate. Leonardo DiCaprio? Nah, doing a film already. Yeah, who have we got left? And then they were like, we could get you Hugh Grant. You're like, yeah, I guess. Is anyone else available? No, he's the best. Okay, I guess we'll have to go Hugh Grant. You can't then be like, yeah, it was your dream to have Hugh Grant be in this movie. You wrote the whole movie for him and set it up for him. Like, not really. You know, we just thought we'd make the best of what we could in that scenario. So I think there are some decisions, if you know what you know now, you could have made differently. But in general, I actually think in general, he kind of made the best of what he had. I think every single position had some logic to it. The Wicked one's maybe the most questionable, because I have always thought Wid's been a bit underrated, because when he is on the right champion and he is in the right mindset and the right sort of team, he can be a very strong physical one-on-one type of top laner, even though it doesn't really exist as a meta anymore. But the rest, I thought all had their own merits. Like Nif definitely has his own merits if you put him on the right sort of team. He is mechanically skilled, and he does have a very good style. It just wasn't necessarily suited to Tabs. Again, Tabs, I think, can be a strong player. I think people have undersold him because of that last loss at Worlds, and yeah, they're terrible because they lost to Kaboom. Yeah, okay, mate, whatever. I think people have undersold his skills. He definitely was a very strong AD carry, and with the right support, could have been even better and had more of an impact on Alliance themselves. Shook, he already was the one they wanted. So again, just some thoughts here on Alliance. Don't say it's the team that Froggen picked and this is his dream team and it was the super team. Yeah, it was sort of, and he sort of picked him, but it wasn't entirely. So I think I've made some good points there. Nice to write your own reviews. So that's the end of this one.